Hi everyone, and welcome to this online workshop, How to Write a Sentence. I'm Dr. Leanne Waters, and I'll be guiding you through our main topics and exercises. Here's what we'll be covering today. First, we're going to remind ourselves why we should pay attention to proper grammar and sentence construction, particularly at the academic level. Second, we're going to run through some basic definitions. Words like nouns, verbs, prepositions, and many more. These are the basic ingredients of the sentence, and it's a good idea for us to have a working knowledge of what they all mean before we start putting them into practice. Additionally, we're going to look at different types of sentences. Understanding how and why we put sentences together in the way we do will help to mitigate some of the grammatical problems students often encounter later on. When it comes to writing, there are some common problems that crop up for all of us, and we'll be covering a couple of these issues today. These include what are called comma splices and run-on sentences, as well as references to unclear pronouns that leave your reader a little confused. Don't worry, we have exercises throughout the workshop that will help you get to grips with all of this, and I'll also provide answers and commentary to make everything clear. Don't forget to pause the workshop when you want to do these exercises and to hit play again when you're ready for the answers. Finally, we want to see how all this information is put into action in the academic environment. So we'll be concluding today by looking at and thinking about how you as a writer can achieve what we often call flow. So let's get started. Okay. So why is it so important for us to use proper grammar and effective sentence construction? 1. Terminology. Students may have learned about nouns, verbs, prepositions, etc. a very long time ago. However, often the basics of writing are not retaught later in education. When students receive feedback on assignments, they may not understand what has gone wrong in terms of their writing. This is because they don't understand to what the tutor is referring. A knowledge of the terminology gives us a language to talk about language, so that we can use shorthand to discuss our writing and therefore improve in the future. We never stop learning about language, and we must perpetually relearn basic sentence level rules to ensure that we are writing well. 2. Clarity of expression. Too often, good ideas get lost in bad sentences. In academia, we want readers to engage with our ideas, but readers can't always access our ideas if, for example, they don't know to what this or that refers. They're exhausted or confused by long, multi-clause sentences, or if they're poorly directed in terms of how we want our work to be read. In other words, if they've been provided with poor punctuation. 3. Professionalism. Often, and mistakenly, students believe that proper scholarly writing requires academic jargon, those fancy sounding words that imply intellectual gravitas. On the contrary, good academic writing requires only clarity, which can only be achieved through the proper use of grammar and an understanding of sentence construction. Developing sentence-level skills is a necessity for developing a professional and academic register when writing. 4. The production of ideas. Have you ever found that you're halfway through an assignment, but you're still uncertain about your topic or about your argument? We use words and sentences to record our ideas, but writing things down also helps to create and to shape our ideas. Sentences have rules that we have to follow, and by putting our ideas into full sentences, we force ourselves to develop those ideas further, to unpack or explain fully exactly what we mean to say, and to recognize the ways in which our ideas are problematic or limited. Remember, writing your ideas down is not only a record of your ideas, it can stimulate new modes of thinking too. 5. Building blocks. Think of the sentence as one brick in a house. Each brick has to be the correct size and shape. The bricks have to be put together in the right way to make the house. Similarly, sentences are the foundation of all academic writing. Sentences are the building blocks we need to construct any assignment. For example, we have to master our writing at the sentence level before we can master the paragraph, the essay, the dissertation, and finally the monograph. If you can master the sentence, you can master any of these tasks. But before we can do so, we're going to need some basic definitions. Let's look at the ingredients of the sentence and how we go about using those ingredients. Our first ingredient is the common noun. This word is the person, place, or thing that is doing or being something. I'll repeat that again. This is the person, place, or thing in the sentence that is doing something or being something. For example, the aim of the project was to develop software that could analyze the data faster. Aim, project, software, and data are all things. As such, these are the common nouns of this sentence. A proper noun is a named person, place, or thing, and it takes an initial capital letter. I'll say that again. A proper noun is a named person, place, or thing. For example, Alice is the name of a person, Dublin is the name of a place, and Starbucks and Pfizer are names of companies. These are all proper nouns. A pronoun is a word that refers to an unnamed someone or something. For example, I, you, he, she, it, this, and that are all pronouns. We don't know the names of the people, places, or things. An adjective is a word in the sentence that describes a noun or a pronoun. For example, there is a significant disparity between Chaucer's The Knight's Tale and The Miller's Tale, despite the fact that they share similar plot lines in the Canterbury Tales. The word significant is describing the noun disparity, and the word similar is describing the noun plot lines. As such, significant and similar are the adjectives of this sentence. Here's a more complicated sentence. The multidisciplinary database EBSCO provided useful material for the group's assignment. The word multidisciplinary is describing the noun database, and the word useful is describing the noun material. As such, multidisciplinary and useful are the adjectives of this sentence. Remember, you need to be able to identify your nouns before you can identify the adjectives that are describing them. Now let's move on to our next set of ingredients. A conjunction is a word that connects two separate parts of a sentence together. We call the parts of the sentence clauses, and this is important to remember as we move through the workshop. Generally, we do not begin a sentence with a conjunction because to do so implies that something should come before this part or this clause of the sentence. Words like and, but, if, for, nor, or, so, and as are all examples of conjunctions. A verb is a word that describes the action, state, or occurrence of the sentence. For example, World War II was a military conflict from 1939 to 1945 that engulfed much of the globe. In this sentence, the word was is the past tense version of the verb to be, and the word engulfed is the past tense version of the verb to engulf. The second example here is, statistics give a sample of data to make inferences about probability and variability. The word give is the present tense version of the verb to give, and to make is what we call a verb infinitive, which we'll look at now shortly. For the moment, all you need to remember is that verbs give us action in sentences, and in doing so, they provide a commentary on the subject or the noun of the sentence, the person, place, or thing that's doing the action or having the action done to them. Importantly, all verbs have a correlating verb infinitive. The verb infinitive is its basic form. In other words, this action word hasn't been conjugated to fit a particular noun or tense. For example, to be, to analyze, to make, to assess, and to monitor are all verb infinitives. Nothing has been done to them yet, and they aren't related to a particular noun or a particular tense. A common problem in writing is what we call the split infinitive. This is when a word, usually an adverb, is inserted between the to and the verb. For example, to boldly go, to casually walk, to kindly ask, and to really want are all split infinitives, and they're grammatically incorrect. The correct phrasing should be to go boldly, to walk casually, to ask kindly, and to want very much. Never split the to from the verb. We're nearly there now, so let's look at two more sentence ingredients before moving on. A preposition is a word that tells us the position or situation of a noun or pronoun. Prepositions describe the noun's relation to another word in the sentence. For example, to, from, after, in, up, on, at, across, and with are all prepositions. Prepositions usually precede the noun or the pronoun. As the name implies, prepositions pre-position us as readers. For this reason, sentences should not end with a preposition, because this kind of word implies that something is coming next. For example, instead of the student did not tell his supervisor which university he was going to, one should write the student did not tell his supervisor to which university he was going. To is the preposition of the sentence, and as such, it should not come at the end of the sentence. Finally, an adverb is a word that alters the meaning of another word by expressing manner, place, time, or degree. Where adjectives are used to describe the noun of the sentence, adverbs, as the name implies, are often used to describe the verb of the sentence. Adverbs describe action. For example, adverbs like quickly and truthfully describe the manner of something. Adverbs like here and outside describe the place of something. Adverbs like now, first, and regularly describe the time of something. And adverbs like very, to, and almost describe the degree of something. Let's look at the example here. I really don't understand what the assignment requires. Or, the laboratory results simply do not support the original hypothesis. Really and simply both describe the degree of understanding and support, respectively. As such, the words are both adverbs. If it helps, you can think of adverbs as intensifiers in a sentence. They intensify the meaning of another word in that sentence. Now that you have the basic ingredients of the sentence, let's move on to your first exercise. In this exercise, I'd like you to write out the following sentences. When you've done that, see if you can identify the nouns, verbs, adjectives, conjunctions, prepositions, and adverbs in each. The sentences are: 1. The famous author arrived at his conclusion and then quickly summarized his complex argument. 2. The tests required a very long time, but after this extensive period, the writing process was very brief. Don't forget to pause the workshop because on the next slide, I'll run through the answers and some explanations. Okay, so let's run through the first sentence together, word by word. The famous author arrived at his conclusion and then quickly summarized his complex argument. The is what we call the definite article. The definite article precedes the noun in a sentence, and we use it when we think the reader already knows about that particular noun. For instance, we use the definite article when we've already mentioned the noun or when there is just one of something, like the kitchen in a house or the book on a table. Famous is an adjective in this sentence because it describes the noun. Author is a noun, a person, place, or thing. Arrived is a verb, the action word of the sentence, and here it's in the past tense. At is a preposition, which positions us before the upcoming noun. His is a pronoun because it's an unnamed someone or something. His is also what we call the genitive or the possessive case. All this means is that the word denotes ownership. In this case, he owns the conclusion. It's his. So his is a pronoun in the genitive case. Conclusion is another noun because it's a thing. And is a conjunction. Then is an adverb because it describes the time of his arrival at the conclusion. In this way, it's describing the verb arrive. Likewise, quickly is an adverb because it's describing the verb summarized. Remember, adverbs often describe verbs and they denote manner, time, place, or degree. Summarized, as you've probably guessed, is another verb, and it's in the past tense. And we have another genitive pronoun there, his. Complex is another adjective because it describes the argument. And finally, argument is another noun because it's a thing. In your own time, have a look at the answers to the second example. And if you're unsure about anything, don't forget to refer back to the definitions given earlier. One different thing you'll notice in the second sentence is the word a. While the is called the definite article, a is called the indefinite article of the sentence. Next, I'd like to address what are called sentence clauses. This will help later when we talk about the use of commas in sentences. The clause of a sentence just means a part of the sentence. Sentence clauses are separated by conjunctions like and or but, or clauses can be separated by punctuation marks like commas. There are two types of sentence clauses, and the first is the independent clause. Independent clauses form a complete sentence. We call them independent because they don't require anything new in order to make sense of the sentence. For example, the study was carried out carefully. This sentence can stand alone and it makes perfect sense. Why? It's because this sentence contains a subject and a predicate. The subject of the sentence is the noun, the person, place, or thing, and the predicate is the part of the sentence that contains the verb and that comments on the subject. If you have a subject and a predicate, you have an independent clause. In our first example, in blue, the study is our subject and was carried out is our predicate. In our second example, in orange, the analysis is our subject and failed to address is our predicate. The second type of sentence clause is the dependent clause. This is the part of a sentence that cannot stand alone. This part of a sentence requires an independent clause to complete the sentence. For example, despite mid-Victorian poverty levels, there were many aristocratic families living in England. This sentence has two clauses, which are separated by the comma. The dependent clause is despite mid-Victorian poverty levels. We know this because, though it has a subject, the poverty levels, it does not have a predicate, a verb commenting on the subject. Moreover, this clause starts with the word despite. This is what's called a subordinating conjunction. Other examples of subordinating conjunctions are if and although. Despite, if, and although immediately tell us that this is a dependent clause. By the time we get to the punctuation mark, the comma that separates one clause from another, we'll realize that we need another clause in order for the sentence to make sense. Thus we get, there were many aristocratic families. This is the independent clause that completes the sentence. It contains both a subject and a predicate. It can stand alone. And crucially, it helps us make sense of the first clause of the sentence. In this quick exercise, I'd like you to identify the dependent clause of each sentence and the independent clause in each sentence. You can write the sentences down and underline or highlight the clauses, or you can simply note the clauses in your mind. Don't forget to pause the workshop because the answers will be on the next slide. As you can see, in the first sentence, the independent clause is the extent to which anesthesia causes unconsciousness is difficult to establish. It has a subject and a predicate, and it can stand alone. The dependent clause is, although anesthesia undoubtedly induces unresponsiveness and amnesia. This clause does have a subject and a predicate, but it begins with the subordinating conjunction although, and this tells us that it needs another clause attached to it in order for the sentence to make sense. Likewise, the dependent clause of sentence 2 is, if we apply Foucault's analysis of the prison system from his book Discipline and Punish. As in sentence 1, we know this is a dependent clause because of the subordinating conjunction if. The sentence doesn't make sense without our independent clause after the comma. It is clear that the theatre and the prison operate in similar fashions with similar purposes. Again, here we have a subject and a predicate, and this clause helps us make sense of the first dependent one. Now that you have a sense of sentence clauses and how and why we put them together, let's take a look at a punctuation mark that acts both as a bridge and as a barrier in the sentence. This is the comma. As you can see, a missing comma or a badly positioned comma can radically alter the meaning of a sentence, so it's important that we know how to use them. You can think of all punctuation marks, including commas, as road signs. Your reader is a driver on the road, and your punctuation operates like the road signs that guide the driver. Punctuation, and commas specifically, instruct your reader. They tell the reader how to read and interpret the sentence. As you've already seen, and as Robert Moore outlines, the function of the comma is to mark the end of one clause and the beginning of the next. And, as we've just discussed, the comma signals to the reader when we're transitioning from a dependent clause into an independent clause and vice versa. For example, look at the sentence Robert Moore gives us. He writes, for instance, since a subordinating conjunction comes always at the beginning of a dependent clause, A comma will tell the reader where an initial dependent clause ends and the independent clause begins. The sentence you just read is an example. The comma also plays an important role in relation to the noun of the sentence. Commas help to create what's called an adjective clause, which is a part of the sentence that gives us more qualification about the noun. As Moore tells us, sometimes an adjective clause should be separated from the noun it modifies by commas, and sometimes it should not. It is the noun which determines whether or not the clause should be set off. If the noun is already self-defined, it needs no further definition from the adjective clause, and the clause is separated by commas. Let's look at some examples of this. Churchill, who was the Prime Minister between 1951 and 1955, won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953. The noun of this sentence is Churchill. The clause that falls between the two commas is the adjective clause. It gives us further qualification and detail about the noun. But, significantly, the adjective clause is not necessary to the sentence. If we removed the adjective clause, the sentence would still make sense. In this case, without the adjective clause, the sentence would read, Churchill won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953. This is a complete sentence with a subject and a predicate. The clause, who was the Prime Minister between 1951 and 1955, simply provides more description and qualification, and such adjective clauses are always bookended by commas on either side. If you look at the second example, you can see the same thing is happening. One of the big debates among grammarians and scholars in general is the Oxford comma debate. Put quite simply, the Oxford comma is a comma that comes before a conjunction in a sentence, such as and or but. Let's look at an example. In this image on the left, we're presented with a list of items. I had eggs, toast, and orange juice. The first version of the sentence uses the Oxford comma, and the second version does not. We already know that commas separate the clauses of a sentence. More than this, however, commas also separate meaning in a sentence, with each clause becoming self-contained. In a list using the Oxford comma, each item is separated out, just as each clause is likewise separated. In a list that does not use the Oxford comma, the last two items on the list get grouped together. Thus, the Oxford comma can give much more definition, because it tells the reader what things or ideas should be grouped together in the sentence and what things or ideas should be separated. Additionally, the Oxford comma is useful when you have long sentences that use several conjunctions like and. For instance, take a look at the example on the right side of the screen. The researcher was a very kind person, and her theories about Marxism and Victorian culture were proven correct. In this sentence, there are two ands, so we give the sentence greater definition by using the Oxford comma in red there. The second and correctly groups together the researcher's theories about Marxism and Victorian culture. We want to group these two things together because they are both proven correct. The first and, which is preceded by the Oxford comma, separates the first clause of the sentence from the second clause. We want to separate these clauses because the researcher's kindness is not necessarily related to her theories being proven correct. In other words, we use the Oxford comma to separate clauses and meaning, and we don't use the Oxford comma when we want to group things or ideas together. The next example we're going to use comes from Lynn Truss's 2005 book, Eats, Shoots and Leaves, The Zero Tolerance Approach to Punctuation. Truss takes a humorous approach to grammar and punctuation, but her examples are excellent. Let's have a think about why the proper use of the comma matters so much in terms of how we interpret sentences and their meaning. The panda eats shoots and leaves. As it is currently written, the meaning of this sentence is as follows. A panda eats some shoots, perhaps bamboo shoots, and that same panda then eats some leaves. The nouns of the sentence are panda, shoots, and leaves. The verb of the sentence is eats. Here, we've introduced the Oxford comma into the sentence. Look how it changes the meaning of the sentence. The panda now eats only the shoots, and then the panda goes away. Panda and shoots are still nouns, and eats is still a verb. However, leaves has changed from a noun to a verb. Why? This is because of something called parallel structure. Parallel structure is when there's a balance in the sentence, when each clause follows the same patterns in terms of its construction. In the first clause of this example, we had a subject, the panda, performing an action, eating. When we introduce the Oxford comma and create a new clause, immediately our brain will look for the same pattern or the same sequence we found in the first clause. As such, our subject, the panda, gets carried over into the second clause and, like the first clause, the subject performs an action. In the second clause, the action is leaving. In this way, the sequence of the first clause gets repeated in the second. This is parallel structure, and it's something most readers will look for without even realizing it. Now look at the final version of this sentence. Here we've introduced two commas. In doing so, we now have three clauses, and we expect each clause to follow the same pattern or sequence. Like before, panda is the noun and the subject, and eats is the verb. But because of parallel structure, both shoots and leaves have become verbs. In this version of the sentence, the panda eats something, then the panda shoots something, and then the panda goes away. Now that you have a thorough understanding of commas, here's your next exercise. Write out each of the sentences below. When you have them written out, put the commas in the correct positions in each sentence. Don't forget to pause this workshop, because on the next slide, I'll give answers and explanations. The first sentence is fairly straightforward. The basic tenet of semiotics, the theory of sign and sign usage, is anti-realist. The subject of this sentence is the tenet of semiotics. Here, the second clause of the sentence is the adjective clause. Remember, this is the clause that gives further details or qualification about the subject of the sentence, and it is always bookended by a comma on either side. If we removed this adjective clause, the sentence would still read perfectly. For example, the basic tenet of semiotics is anti-realist. This works with or without the extra information within the commas. The second sentence is a little trickier. Although art history as a whole is affected by the wake of the linguistic turn, the authentication of oeuvres in the cases of Rembrandt, Van Gogh, and Hal has been a particularly positivistic pursuit. Now there's a lot going on here, but this sentence uses the principles at which we've already looked. Look at the second clause of this sentence. Like before, as a whole is an adjective clause. It refers to the subject of the sentence, which is art history, and it gives us further qualification insofar as it tells us that we're talking about art history in its entirety. As an adjective clause, as a whole takes a comma on either side, and the sentence would still work perfectly even if it wasn't there. The next comma comes at the end of linguistic turn. Why? Because this is marking the end of a dependent clause. For a moment, pretend that the adjective clause as a whole isn't there, and now look at that first clause in its entirety. It begins with the subordinating conjunction although, which tells us that we need another independent clause for this sentence to make sense. The comma after linguistic turn indicates that we're moving to that independent clause. Finally, the last 3 commas in this sentence are there because we've made a list of artists: Rembrandt, Van Gogh, and Hal. These are 3 separate people, and each takes his own clause. You can see that these authors use the Oxford comma, the comma before the and. Now that you have a better sense of how to use commas effectively, let's move on to some common problems that arise in students' writing and how we can go about fixing them. The first problem we want to address is what's called a comma splice. This is when a student uses a comma to join 2 independent clauses together. For example, immovable artifacts in archaeological studies are called features. Non-artifactual evidence that have cultural significance are called ecofacts. As we saw before, commas are used to mark the transition from a dependent clause to an independent clause or vice versa. But both of these clauses are independent because each contains a subject and a predicate. In this instance, a comma is the incorrect punctuation mark, and it can make your reader feel like the clauses are toppling in on one another. This is particularly a problem in academia because you're probably discussing very complex ideas and your reader is already required to digest quite a lot of information. Make the reading process easier for your reader by pacing your clauses and avoiding comma splice. You can avoid comma splice by using a conjunction or a new sentence when you have 2 independent clauses, as in the examples below. Run-on sentences are similar to comma splice problems. This is when a sentence gets ahead of itself and uses 2 or more independent clauses without any marked transition from one clause to another. For example, the poem portrayed the theme of madness it focused on asylums of the 19th century. Now that's a difficult sentence to read. The meaning of the sentence gets lost and reading becomes a confusing task. As with comma splices, run-on sentences can be avoided by using either a conjunction or a new sentence, as in the examples below. We've already talked about parallel structure, which relates to our next problem, mixed forms. Reading becomes easier when the same pattern of words is used throughout each clause of a sentence. This kind of parallel structure demonstrates that 2 or more words or ideas are of equal importance in a sentence. For instance, look at the examples below. In the first sentence, scanning and analyzing are both in the present participles. They're verbs in action. To collect, on the other hand, is a verb infinitive, and it doesn't follow the same pattern. Scanning, analyzing, and to collect. Rhythmically, this doesn't quite work. Likewise, in the second sentence, to identify and to explain are both verb infinitives. Analyzing, however, is in the present participle. It doesn't follow the same pattern. Requires students to identify a theme, analyzing how it functions, and to explain the purpose. this doesn't sound right either. The sentence keeps stopping and starting from clause to clause. Let's look at how parallel structure can make a difference to these sentences. In these versions of the sentences, each clause and each verb follows the same pattern: scanning, analyzing, and collecting. Likewise, in the second sentence, requires students to identify a theme, to analyze how it functions, and to explain the purpose. Parallel structure means that it's easier to make sense of the sentence. Why? Because we've created a rhythm, a flow, and our reader almost knows what to expect. We'll return to this idea of flow shortly, but for now, let's look at one more common problem in sentences. Our final problem is the frequency of unclear pronouns. Look at these sentences. In the first, we're told that when Joyce and Proust first met, he mostly talked about duchesses. But the second clause doesn't make it clear whether the he refers to Joyce or Proust. In the second sentence, we're told, after putting the last object on the tray, he poured water on it. But the second clause doesn't state whether the water is poured on the object or the tray. And in the third sentence, we're told, Kennedy was admired for his views and criticized for his affairs. This is evidenced in newspapers from this time. But the second sentence of this example doesn't tell us whether the this refers to the fact that Kennedy was admired or the fact that Kennedy was criticized. So it's important that you keep the subject of your sentence to the fore by restating the subject when necessary. In the first sentence, it was Proust who talked about duchesses. In the second sentence, the water was poured on the tray. And in the third sentence, depending on where you want to take your reader, you need to restate whether it was the admiration, the criticism, or both the admiration and criticism of Kennedy that was evidenced in the newspapers. This kind of detail is particularly important in academia, because often we're dealing with abstract concepts and theories, so our sentences can become very complex. Don't lose sight of the subject of your sentence. Now that we've covered some basic issues within sentence construction, let's have a think about how we put it all together and how we go about achieving what's often called flow. Achieving flow is not as difficult as it may seem. Flow refers to how we put sentences together in a paragraph and how well those sentences work beside one another. Sometimes it's as simple as varying your vocabulary so that you're not repeating words. But often, when we're working towards a paragraph, flow is achieved through variation in sentence length. For instance, too many consecutive short sentences can be quite frustrating to read. Too many consecutive medium-length sentences can be quite dull when reading. And too many consecutive long sentences can be absolutely exhausting to your reader. If you mix it up and vary the length from one sentence to the next, a rhythm is created, and your reader stays engaged with your ideas. Let's look at an example of how sentence variation can change the reader's experience of a text. This example from Gary Provost shows us the importance of making your sentences sound right when you put them together in a paragraph. Listen carefully as I read this out. This sentence has 5 words. Here are 5 more words. 5-word sentences are fine, but several together are monotonous. Listen to what is happening. The writing is getting boring. The sound of it drones. It's like a stuck record. The ear demands some variety. Now listen. I vary the sentence length and I create music. Music. The writing sings. It has a pleasant rhythm, a lilt, a harmony. I use short sentences, and I use sentences of medium length. And sometimes, when I am certain the reader is rested, I will engage him with a sentence of considerable length, a sentence that burns with energy and builds with all the impetus of a crescendo, the roll of the drums, the crash of the cymbals, sounds that say, listen to this, it is important. So write with a combination of short, medium, and long sentences. Create a sound that pleases the reader's ear. Don't just write words, write music. Paying attention to sentence variation is an important strategy for all kinds of writing, including academic writing. Not only will this make the reading experience more enjoyable, but it will mean that readers can access your ideas easily, and what's more, they'll want to do so. Here are a few practical tips to take away from this workshop. 1. Read your work out loud. Ask yourself, does it sound right? 2. Have someone else read your work to you. At which sections are they slowing down? At which points are they tripping up? Why? These are the areas that need attention. 3. Have someone read your work and then explain your work in your own words. What aspects of your idea did they not understand when they read your work? In other words, which aspects of your idea are not translating, and why not? What aspects of your idea did you include or exclude when you were explaining it verbally? 4. Come to the UCD Writing Centre before you submit your assignment. To see what we do or to book an appointment, please visit www.ucd.ie/writing centre. There's plenty of resources out there for people who are looking to improve their writing, and so I would encourage you to have a look at some of these. Thank you so much for your time today, and I hope you found this workshop useful. To find out more about the UCD Writing Centre or to book an appointment with us, please visit www.ucd.ie/writing centre.